Your Eminences, Your Excellency, Your Most Eminent Highness, President Peter Grace, and ladies and gentlemen, tonight for me is a moment from humility. To stand here before you, the members of the most ancient order of its kind in the world, formed in the Holy Land 900 years ago, which is a monument to the highest values of free men and women, is to be reminded once again that the only true calling of man is service to God.
The relationship needs to be uncovered between Anglican's father, Anglican, and the Knights of Malta.
Welcome back, everybody. In this episode, we'll be talking about the Knights of Malta, a group recently alleged to be involved with the secrecy surrounding UFOs. But admittedly, a lot of the tools required to investigate the Knights have been out of my wheelhouse. So I've asked our next guest to help us out. Someone whose expertise of late has been hunting down names, histories, money trails, and shadowy groups that have been eerily connected to advanced aerospace technology. And what ensued was a really cool conversation. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming our next guest, Jason Samosa. Well. Fancy seeing you here, Jason. How's it going, man?
Oh my gosh, is that JP Touchette? Dude.
It is.
What are the odds? Dude, it's good to see you.
Good to see you too, man. Dude, I just want to say publicly, I know we were just talking about it, but thanks for being so nice to me off camera, and it means a lot to me, and also extending huge congratulations. You just went full time. You've got this awesome new video about the Maynard Consortium, or what you think might be representing the Maynard Consortium, and you just went on Jesse Michaels' show. So awesome to see you have that success, man. So thank you for taking your now busy schedule to come on this show.
Oh, dude, thanks, JP. That's really kind. It's been an awesome few months, and yeah, on the being a friend and everything, it's no big deal. I mean, it's just nice to chat with someone like-minded. For those who don't know, JP and I connected on Instagram, and he's pretty good at the meme game. Beyond these conversations, I occasionally get, I'll look at something and JP's posted something hilarious, so that also helps,
Okay. I'm glad the memes help. It's good to know. Yeah. Well, Jason, let's cut down to brass tacks. I got you here for a reason. We've got this very interesting little rabbit hole in the UFO story, the UFO subject, and that is the Knights of Malta. It's a very interesting subject, but there's very limited information about it, and it's just kind of become a name that's thrown around. Because you could probably explain this better than I, would you mind laying out for the folks at home how this came into the UFO zeitgeist?
That's a great question. I don't know when people started talking about the Knights of Malta as being important to this, but I remember when I first noticed it was when Jesse Michaels did his big interview with Harold Malmgren. And that's a big deal of an interview. That guy was a presidential advisor for like 4 or 5 presidents. So he was really like a totally huge caliber of a guest. So I was quite glued. And there's this whole section in that interview where they start talking about the Knights of Malta. And Malmgren was close with the likes of Henry Kissinger, who is arguably like the most powerful individual in the post-war era, you could say. He's saying that the Knights of Malta have more to do with what's going on behind the scenes than people realize.
Now, going back to 1933, the relationship needs to be uncovered between Anglican's father, Anglican, and the Knights of Malta.
Wow.
Because the Knights of Malta had their long historical connection with the Vatican. And indeed have this special diplomatic status you can have an international passport for the night. I forget what's it's a sovereign state for a handful of people,
Yes.
but it's all connected with the Vatican.
He doesn't illuminate everything. He acknowledges that he's been out of the picture by this point for 20, 30 years, so he doesn't know what's going on now. But then Jesse Michael showed a bunch of connections, and then I started looking into it, and I was like, wow, this is really interesting because we tend to ask the question, which agency, or I don't know, which intelligence agency, or is it the Air Force or the Navy or the Department of Energy that's overseeing this stuff? But what about these extra groups that sit maybe above or cut through various governments? They're transnational. The Knights of Malta is a transnational entity that is like a millennia old and does have some interesting links to this. So it's a super cool conversation. And I think it's one of these topics that, people who get into this subject, you get the basics in place, right? You learn about Roswell, you learn about the occult connections, Blue Book, etc. You do your kind of bachelor of arts, as we would call it here in England. And you're kind of looking for your master's study, what's next. And I think the Knights of Malta is one of these really interesting topics that's quite revealing about how power works. So that's maybe a high level teaser.
I love it. And because that's exactly where I learned about it. And I think that's probably exactly where a lot of people who have come into this conversation in the last few years since Lou Elizondo, since David Grush have heard. And, it is a tactile way of pointing at a real entity that would be behind the statement, like someone like Harold Malmgren said in this Jesse Michaels interview, that I think it was when he was speaking with Richard Bissell, this shadowy character who helped make Area 51, if I'm correct, that there are other forces at play, other shadowy forces. And growing up, it was like, the Knights Templar were, these shadowy millennia-year-long orders were relegated to things like Assassin's Creed, right? The Knights Templar. Yeah. But it sounds like something out of a video game or a James Bond movie. And funny enough, there's connections there. But I mean, who actually are they? I mean, through my research, it seems that they were from the Knights Templar. Their traces can be traced back to the Crusades, and like they were the Knights Hospitaller, like that one character in Kingdom of Heaven. Am I correct in that?
Yeah. So before we even get into the nitty gritty of like, what are they doing today? I do think it's really worth clearing this up because you can understand the personality of an organization like this better by understanding its history. And, also if anyone else is kind of new to this, you may be thinking, well, the Knights of Malta, I thought it was the Knights Templar, or like, JP just mentioned the Knights Hospitalier. And so it's confusing, right? Who are these groups? How do they connect? And I think that can be a really good grounding. So I am by no means a medieval historian. What I'm going to share with you is like the skeleton that I needed to get my head around what's going on. So here it is. The Crusades are happening in sort of 1090 kind of era. So you're going into the 11th century. And there's lots and lots of people going to fight, and that means there's people being wounded. And a group of knights set up, I don't even know if they're knights at this point, but they set up a hospital outside of Jerusalem. That becomes a huge base of conversation because there are people coming into Jerusalem who stop at that hospital before they go and fight. There are people coming back from the battlefield to that hospital who have just been in the land. So it becomes a nexus of intelligence sharing. This hospital becomes kind of a critical junction for people to share what's going on there before I go in, tell me this. And it's that detail that leads the Hospitalier to becoming more than just a hospital. And the Pope grants them a certain status. I can't remember the name of this, but it basically means they become knights. And within 100 years, they literally do become knights, right? It becomes a military force alongside other crusading groups. So eventually the Crusades leads to those groups getting kicked out of the Holy Land. And they need to go find new places to be because they can no longer just hang out or go and fight. Like this has been lost. And one of the consequences of this is that they need to find somewhere new to be. So they go to Cyprus. This is around 1300. Then they go to Rhodes, which is, I think, the year, 1310 maybe. So this group then become the Knights of Rhodes, right? They're now associated with Rhodes. And I've been to this place where they used to be. It's a relatively small island. Eventually, I think it's Suleiman the Magnificent conquers Rhodes. And in about 1500, they then move to Malta. So this is when they become the Knights of Malta. So this clears something up, right? You may have heard the Knights Hospitalier. You may have heard the Knights of Rhodes and the Knights of Malta. That was all one group for a period. There is another dynamic here which is worth covering before we go into the detail of the Knights of Malta. You may be asking, well, what about the Knights Templar? Great question. This was a rival crusading group. And most people will know that the Knights Templar were basically excommunicated, and eventually, many of them were killed, and some of them had to flee. I'm not an expert on the whole history of the Knights Templar, but there's something interesting here that's worth talking about. I think it was somewhere in the 1500s that the Pope at the time said, look, all of these different groups are getting a little bit too crazy. Why don't we consolidate them? Knights Templar, you guys can continue, but you need to integrate into the Knights of Malta. And guess what? The Knights of Malta are going to run this new group, so you're going to be subordinate to them. The Knights Templar say, no, we don't want to do this. And so they basically, that's when the excommunication and all the violence starts to happen, because they say, we're not going to play along with this plan. So they kind of conclude their rebellion against the Pope. The Pope was already frustrated or suspicious of them. This lack of willingness to submit to his will led to that dark outcome. And whatever property and belongings of theirs that the Pope could seize were seized and given to the Knights of Malta. This is really important because, later it's going to be interesting to talk about different esoteric groups and about how they perceive each other and the role they might play in modern politics. Because the Knights of Malta really have been an ally and a function of the Catholic Church throughout their history. Whereas the Knights Templar at many times were pretty much the opposite. And, during this kind of era, I think maybe later, but something important to realize is the Vatican would outlaw Freemasonry. The Vatican did not want Freemasonic Enlightenment thinking, which at that time, Freemasonic lodges were a hotbed for new philosophy about new ways of government, and especially about challenging the Vatican and the monarchies. And the Freemasons, there's some great work by Peter Lavander on this in his book, The Secret Temple, somewhere here, where he points out there's this really interesting, it's a bit of an anecdotal story, but there might be something to it, that the Knights Templar may have ended up joining the Freemasons. They may have fled all the way up to Scotland, and there was some sightings of these knights up there. And then you have the emergence of Scottish Freemasonry, which becomes a big deal. So you've got this kind of split. Knights of Malta, loyal to the Catholic Church. Knights Templar rebel and join the Freemasons, which the Catholic Church already doesn't like. And you can outline, and there's lots of things about this that might be a little bit too black and white, but I think it's useful. You can outline two traditions of philosophy here. One is, let's support this behemoth, this massive top-down government, which is the Catholic Church. The Pope rules. It is about power. It's about centralization, and everyone else is a subject to this. Even if you want to access God, you have to do it through the Pope. The scriptures at this time are written in Latin. So, most people can't even read, let alone read Latin. There's all of these barriers preventing you from getting knowledge in this old tradition. And of course, there's a political economic system with that. The Enlightenment ideals that were eschewed by Freemasonry would become the foundation for the Constitution in America. I'm not saying all Freemasons are good, by the way. Freemasonic lodges are like office spaces, right? It just so happens at this time that the Enlightenment was happening in there. Later, as we're going to see in some things I think we'll end up talking about, sometimes bad things happen in Freemasonic lodges, and that's, they're kind of ambiguous. But at this point, this Enlightenment philosophy goes to America, which is the foundation of the country. Is about liberalism, equality. It's about that transparency. So these two different trajectories there. But maybe where we can climax in a second. I don't know if you have something you want to follow up with, JP, but the Knights of Malta are on Malta until late 1700s. And I think it's just before the turn of the century, before the 1800s, maybe like 1795, Napoleon conquers Malta. Napoleon represents this Enlightenment, Freemasonic, Templar kind of philosophy. And he's going about and he's introducing a new way of governing things. And don't get me wrong, I read a big biography of Napoleon. He had some problems. He also did a lot of really good stuff. Like that guy was a force for powerful change. And, some great things happened. But the Knights of Malta lose Malta. And this is where we enter this slightly more modern era, because up until that point, they were essentially a nation state. They ran Malta, they had their own laws, they had their own currency. But as you go into the 1800s, the Knights of Malta become something different. They no longer really have a territory. They become a sort of a function of the Pope's transnational power. And this is where, you start to see a slightly new version of this group emerging.
Wow. First of all, that is incredibly impressive to actually hear the trajectory of it, because it is so muddy and it's hard to, at least for me, it was really difficult to parse out. But what I'm understanding is, despite all of this history, despite all of the changes, because it's such an old order, what's seeping through the most is that, number one, this order is kind of the chosen favorite child of the Pope, of the Catholic Church. And number two, although its motto is, let me pull this up so I don't butcher this, Tuitio Fidei et Obsequium Pauperum, defense of the faith and assistance to the poor, despite its, hospital origins, it was also really good at intelligence. And so I wonder, just like if seeping through from what you said, is that part of the reason why they were able to stay around, because they were like a hotbed of intelligence? Is that, do you think that kind of carried through the ages?
Yeah, I think especially as you get into the 1800s, I mean, certainly like that original thing about the hospital is very interesting. But, after that period, they kind of they have their own territory, so they don't need anyone to favor them. They can just be strong and exist. But there comes a point, yes, after the 1800s where they provide a unique service. And in the 1800s up to World War II is its own era. And then especially after World War II, they provide an even more unique service. So part of that is intelligence, it's access, it's infrastructure. It's interesting to those two different eras maybe have different answers to the value they provide. After 1800s, after the year 1800 and the Napoleonic Revolution, the American Revolution and the founding of America is a success for a period at least. But in Europe, Napoleon is eventually crushed, despite surviving miraculously multiple times. And the monarchies in the Vatican pre-Napoleon had always been fighting. They always had their own conflicts, and they didn't like each other. But post-Napoleon, there was this awareness that we nearly got wiped off the map. The Vatican nearly was completely dismantled. The Knights of Malta lost Malta. The various monarchies were losing control. And so there was this very pragmatic response to this, which was, it happened in the Congress of Vienna, again, exact date, 1815, something like that, where all of these groups came together and said, look, it's a bit like when the mafia families came together later and they said, look, let's stop fighting and function as one. We're stronger that way. And I think this was one of these moments where what we would describe as the establishment really realized our survival depends on us working together despite our differences. So the Congress of Vienna, essentially what came from that was, if there's a revolution in southern Italy, that's Austro-Hungaria's problem. Okay, that's a problem of any nation in Europe that doesn't want revolution, because if I don't help the Italian kingdom to deal with that now, before I know it, I could be dealing with that again, because that's what happened with Napoleon. So the Knights of Malta are attending the Congress of Vienna, And they become part of this, like, how do we prevent revolution? How do we protect the establishment? And, they no longer have a territory. So now it's like, who is a Knight of Malta? Who's part of the chivalric order? Well, it's a lot of the European nobility, actually, as well as, powerful Vatican figures and other groups. So it becomes a network through which those different conservative powers can unite.
This is so fascinating. And I think they should change their motto, because, you've got this front facing, like, if someone had only just read the Wikipedia page, it'd say, but Jason, they're all about humanitarian efforts, aren't they? Right? And so when I first saw that, I'm like, okay, but then what does that have to do with all this shady stuff? And I really, and I hope I'm not moving too fast for you, but just saying, I was researching this order, and there's a video where President Reagan is being inducted or celebrated at this very, very fancy Knights of Malta dinner. And he makes a speech around the minute 15:30-ish. And the whole point of his speech was his whole, what he ran for. And that's what they were celebrating him for, was to be pro-life, right? The rights of the unborn, and to be against the welfare state, which, don't even get me started about that nonsense. But, that's neither here or there. But I find it interesting how an order that's supposed to defend the faith and assist the poor and be humanitarian would back someone like that. And it just it's like a peek into what they might really be about. And you sent me this article where they're like, squashing, they're really protecting the institution of the Catholic Church rather than doing what their motto is. And I just find that very interesting. And that kind of leads us into the more shadier parts of this order.
Yeah, 100%. I think that the public-facing story is very convenient, but there's so many things about the Knights of Malta that it's able to do, and characteristics it has which go so far beyond that. And it's interesting, a moment ago you talked about this potentially being, one of the Pope's favorite orders, one of the more powerful ones. And there are a lot of other orders. And when I was first looking into this, I was curious. I was like, so what makes this different to the Jesuits or Opus Dei or Pro Dio or the Franciscans or the Dominicans? Because there are so many different orders. Or the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre, for example, all of which, I could list 10 more. But there are certain qualities that this group has which are very, very significant that those groups don't have. So, for example, this is the longest lasting of all the groups, firstly. Like I said, there's nobility and transnational power in this group at a level those other groups simply don't have. We can talk about some of the people who are Knights of Malta maybe in a bit to give people like a picture of the caliber. This really is an exclusive club for the people who run the world. There's a very strong CIA presence and intelligence presence in this group. They have the ability, because they're their own sovereign territory, or maybe it's like extraterritorial territory, they can create their own passports, and they have diplomatic immunity. They have observer status at the UN and have diplomatic relationships, I think now with over 100 countries, and that's been continually going up. And, significantly, they have unique access to the Vatican Bank, which is absolutely something we should talk about in terms of what happens after World War II. The Vatican Bank is extraordinarily important if you want to obscure where money is going. And when you're looking at a transnational criminal network, which does emerge after World War II, the Vatican Bank becomes like one of the most important components of that, because I want to obscure where I'm making my money, who the money belongs to, where it's going. The Vatican Bank is the ultimate black box, because the Pope is the one who decides who gets to see. There is no audit that the bank goes through. So, on the charitable group cover is really convenient, But all of those things I've just mentioned make the Knights of Malta very interesting, not just in terms of UFOs, but in terms of transnational geopolitics, right? It's very, very powerful in a way those other groups aren't, and worthy of study.
Yes. Okay, now we're getting into the cream of the crop of the conversation, because this is where it starts getting squirrely, man. Like, okay, so let me ask you this. Do you think that because of what you just laid out, the abilities that the Knights of Malta have, the privileges, let's say, that they have, do you think that's why they attract all of these high up people? And we should get into that right now. Some of the like you say, the caliber of people in there. Do you think that's why it attracts people from, the OSS who became the CIA, people like Angleton, people like Dulles, because it's a tool for them to talk shop in an out of bounds place, in a way for them to conduct operations that is out of the purview of certain control mechanisms they would otherwise have to go through if they were doing it in CONUS and continental United States?
Yes, I do think that's a big part of it. This idea that it has capabilities and functions that are huge. And I think also, at this time, the people running the OSS, the people running various institutions were overwhelmingly very establishment people who didn't want, this. They were dealing with a century where, for the first time, governments had oversight over these institutions. This new sort of democratic revolution that had occurred meant that there was oversight, and for many of these powerful people, that was just frustrating. They'd lived an entire history of human civilization with the strong man just getting to say what happens. Right. And I do think we need to recognize that that's most of human history has been like that. The Vatican runs like that. The Vatican is a top-down institution. It is transnational. It is arguably the biggest intelligence network on Earth, and it's 2,000 years old, which means, some of those intelligence channels are deeply embedded. Every single person in that church is loyal to one person. Presidents come and go and are divisive, but the Pope is a unifying figure for all Catholics. And, all those capabilities I mentioned about obscuring finances, issuing passports, having diplomatic and charitable cover, these are magnificent capabilities if you want to obscure your activities. And, to be sympathetic to the people who found themselves wed to the Vatican. After World War II and as World War II is ending, the United States and the Vatican and the post-war Nazi state were all very worried about communism. Quite rightly, communism was definitely a big concern and terrifying. And so there was this sort of marriage that happens as World War II ends. And the Knights of Malta is the critical centerpiece here, because it's the place where those 3 or 4 different groups intersect. It's kind of like the dinner table for multiple different families that come together. So this unifying fear drove these groups together. The Knights of Malta becomes central to that. And the fact that all of these capabilities are not audited and are not controlled by a single oversight committee or anything is I think hugely relieving to these people.
Oh yeah, man. So let's talk about some of the people who have found themselves connected there historically. I think the first person that I came across in one of the articles you sent was Mr. Undomesticated William Donovan, Mr. Wild Bill Donovan. What's the connection there?
Yeah, Wild Bill Donovan was made a Knight of Malta, I think immediately after World War II. I don't know how fervent his faith was, but he is one of many Catholics who've become intelligence chiefs. William Casey, John McCone, James Jesus Angleton, all Knights of Malta. There are many other Catholic CIA directors. I won't go into them. Some of them might be Jesuits, and some of them certainly are Catholic. I think McCloy as well was Catholic too. I'm thinking of John J. McCloy. I can see his face, but I can't remember his name. Doesn't matter. Bush Sr. was rumored to be a Knights of Malta. I've never found conclusive evidence about that. But, this also goes into JSOC and the National Security Council.
Yep.
You've got Stanley McChrystal and Admiral William McCraven, who are both Knights of Malta, who are very senior in the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Joint Chiefs of Staff often seems to have very religious people in it. They're either from these evangelical networks like the Family or the Knights of Malta, and that's just a weird trend. Alexander Haig, who is the head of NATO and on the National Security Council, Knights of Malta. General Mark Clark, General William Boyd. You've also got military contractors. This is very interesting. You may have heard of the military contractor Blackwater. I think they're now called XE or something. The whole idea of this is it's basically a mercenary group for hire, which is a very strange concept. It's run by two very senior Knights of Malta. Now think about this. Historically, the Knights of Malta were a military force that you could request, hey, help me in this battle, come support me. And now two very powerful Knights of Malta run a military contractor where you have the same dynamic. It's very strange. But there's from here it gets really weird. I could list off a bunch of people who worked in the White House. There's especially the Reagan administration, there are about 8 or 9 Knights of Malta I could list, but you won't know their names. They're kind of boring. But here are some people who were Knights of Malta as well. Reinhard Gehlen, okay? The guy who ran intelligence for the Nazi state in World War II. I think he was one underneath the full head of intelligence. He knew Hitler directly. After the war, he would be recruited by Allen Dulles to basically act as an intelligence chief for the CIA. So for people who don't know about this, basically after World War II, the OSS, the Army intelligence people realized, okay, we don't have a huge structured intelligence apparatus for Eastern Europe. So they went to Reinhard Gehlen and said, look, can we work with you? And you have a whole network of people you've been using through the war. They'll still report to you, and then you just pass your intelligence up to us. That literally happened. And sometimes the intelligence reports from Reinhard Gehlen would simply be passed over to the OSS people, or post-war it was CIA. And then they would just put it onto CIA branded paper and pass it up to Truman. So there was a lot of trust there. But this guy was a Nazi war criminal and absolutely not loyal to the United States. There's a big story there about Reinhard Gehlen. He was part of this deeply corrupt post-war Nazi world, which were doing very strange things. He was a Knight of Malta, okay? So this is, the same group that's got James Jesus Angleton and Stanley McChrystal or whoever, it's also got these kinds of people. You've also got connections to the mafia in Italy as well through people like Umberto Ortolani and Lucio Gelli, who were essentially around the Vatican and interfacing with the mafia who were working with the Vatican. The guy who got Hitler into power, Franz von Papen, was also a Knight of Malta. So that's very interesting. Alan Dulles' nephew, Avery Dulles, very senior Catholic. I'm pretty sure he was a Knight of Malta too. There is J. Peter Grace, who is deeply involved in the deep state in the US, Francis Spellman. And then you've got European leaders, presidents, French presidents, Spanish presidents, Italian prime ministers, European nobility. So a load of European nobles are involved too. At different points, people who ran critical European intelligence agencies like CISMI and CIFRA. Those are really the CIA of France and Italy. I might have that slightly wrong. It could be more like the FBI, but these were big intelligence agencies in Europe. Knights of Malta were running them. And then there's business leaders too. So, just I know I've given you a huge list there, but that gives you an idea of this is a huge group of a mix of post-war American power, of weird fascist underground people, European prime ministers and nobility and intelligence chiefs. kind of coalescing into an anti-communist alliance that was extraordinarily dubious. And of course, this group has no democratic oversight, right? So whatever happens in these meetings is not something that the governments are going to have visibility of. So it's a very, very interesting group of people.
Yes, this is really interesting. We've turned a corner here, and I think for people who aren't into history or not conspiracy theories, but conspiracies and the dark side of history, might have a hard time understanding. Like, you know, you listed, as you say, this huge mix of people. We've got Americans, we've got people from all kinds of other countries, Italians, we've got Nazis, in this one order. And you might think to yourself, like, how could they possibly come together and work together? But one thing that you must come to terms with, especially as an American, is the fact that, you know, the Nazis didn't die there wasn't destroyed. The United States absorbed them into Operation Paperclip and used their skill sets, no matter if they were war criminals or not, like Werner von Braun. And so when you start to come to terms with that incredibly bold move that they did, you start to realize, okay, maybe it's not impossible for these, supposed mortal enemies to work together. And one thing I think my wife pointed out to me is that there was a faction in the United States that was incredibly sympathetic to the Nazi ideals, which is super disturbing to think about. But that's where it starts to get very, very dark. Like, why would we work together with these people, even though on paper we're supposed to be enemies?
Yeah, I think it's a really important pill to swallow, and it requires, I just the other day I released a video where we cover some of those relationships between the American and British elite and the Nazis before World War II, and you realize, like, it is not what you think. Those people got on so well. They were in business together. Even during World War II, they were working together. And it sounds like, again, this is where conspiracy world sometimes can sound crazy, but it's just demonstrably true. Yeah. That there was really a group of people who were over and above the Allied Axis dynamic. This like, there was a fight going on, there was a war where people were dying and there was huge amounts of money being spent. But on top of that, there really was a group of transnational business elites who were making money from that war and who worked together throughout the war to continue making money and doing what they wanted to do. And that is just history. And it is a terrifying, horrifying history, which of course is excluded from our textbooks because it might foment revolution, but it's just the reality. And, the Catholic Church was very unique in that moment because those transnational business people were in some sense neutral, which makes them sound better than they are. But the Catholic Church also was somewhat neutral too. When there was need for diplomatic back channeling during the war, it would happen through the Vatican because they had an open door policy where, people could communicate. And that really was their power through both wars. So it's no wonder that after the war, these powerful elites who are very pragmatic, and the Vatican, who has realized pragmatism is the key to survival, one of the longest lasting institutions ever, get on pretty well. Meanwhile, they're happy for all of us to fight based on our politics and left and right and, tax or no tax. And they're just getting on doing what they're doing.
God. Okay, so you just said something very interesting. If certain back channeling needed to be done, it would be done through the Vatican. And so we should address this before we move on into other cool things. Because one of the main reasons why so many people are interested in the Knights of Malta because of UFOs is because when Harold Malmgren was talking about the Knights of Malta and what the connection between the Angletons and Dulles and the 1933 alleged Magenta UFO crash, that, by the way, David Grush and now Lou Elizondo has now said they're legit. Doesn't make it legit. I haven't seen the proper images or files, but there's a there. What What do you think the Knights of Malta actually had to do, if anything, with this alleged recovery in Magenta in 1933?
If you know me personally, you'll know I'm a sucker for dogs. I always had a dog growing up in the house, and as soon as humanly possible, I'm going to have several little puppies of my own. But in the meantime, when I'm out on the town, I like to watch people walk their beautiful dogs. But, there's one thing I cannot stand, and it is when the human and the dog just don't understand each other. The human is yanking on the dog's throat with that collar, and he's like, come on, we got to go home, buddy. And the dog's like, no, we're going to sniff this. We're not going home. And you can see the tension from hundreds of meters away. I just cringe when I see it. And luckily, this video's sponsor, Compadre, completely eliminates that nonsense. Their custom-fitted omni-no-pull solution, including the illustrious dual attachment, means that the whole dog walking experience completely changes. The Omni No-Pull solution allows you to make gentle corrections around the strongest part of a dog's anatomy, the chest, not the neck, which means that you can guide and train your dog without using painful pinch collars, without using e-collars or choke chains. And the system helps you to gain your dog's attention instead of fight with it. And it establishes actual communication between the two of you. So instead of feeling like walking your dog is a chore, you can both love every walk. If you want to support this channel, head over to compadre.com. That's COMPAWDRE.com to find out for yourself. And when you check out, use code JPT2026 for 10% off your order. Thank you so much, Compadre, for sponsoring the video. Let's get back to the show.
What do you think the Knights of Malta actually had to do, if anything, with this alleged recovery in Magenta in 1933?
Yeah, I'm maybe more cautious than some on this. I think that the crash. So let's talk about what happened with the purported story. A lenticular dish crashes in Magenta, Italy in 1933. Mussolini immediately orders secrecy and sets up a group through, I think it's called RS-33, which has Guglielmo Marconi at its head to study this stuff. And they're basically trying to determine, what is this? Is this German? What science should we do, et cetera? It's all top secret. So no mention of the Vatican yet. But basically there's a claim that Pope Pius knew about this. I mean, David Grush has said this, and that he back-channeled that information to the United States.
So let's start from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. You say it's a 90-year cover-up.
Just about, yeah.
90 years.
1933 was the first recovery in Europe, in Magenta, Italy. They recovered a partially intact vehicle.
It's long been known that the regime of dictator Benito Mussolini documented numerous UAP during this time. This internal memo from the Italian secret services includes crude drawings of the UAPs. It's true, it's real.
Yeah, that actually happened. The Italian government moved it to a secure air base in Italy for the rest of kind of the fascist regime until 1944, 1945. And, the Pope Pius XII back-channeled that.
So the Vatican was involved.
Yeah, and told the Americans what the Italians had, and we ended up scooping it.
Maybe the hope there was that the Pope became aware of this and did not want the communists to have any chance of getting it, maybe, and so helped the US take it away. But what I see is more a dynamic between just general Vatican intelligence and the United States. The Knights of Malta may have somehow been involved, but I don't think there's like a signal here that the Knights of Malta were like the first point of call. It's like, they're the UFO people, we better call them. I don't think it was like that. There are in Jesse, I love Jesse's work so much. And I really, the Malmgren interview and all the information in there is interesting. But one detail that's worth noting is that some of the people who are listed as Knights of Malta being maybe connected to this are part of a splinter group, which is called the Shinny Knights of Malta. So I'm pretty sure General MacArthur's staff and he and a group of those people were actually part of a group that called themselves the Knights of Malta, but it was something completely disconnected. They may have had somewhat similar goals. James Jesus Angleton definitely was a Knight of Malta, and was occasionally in Lombardy, Italy, which is very close to the Magenta crash. So, I don't see that specific story as being key to the Knights of Malta being specifically involved in UFOs. And in general, because I was really curious from what Malmgren said, I was like, oh my goodness, if we look hard enough, could we find evidence that this is the group of people? And I don't think it is. I think the Knights of Malta is just like a group chat,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like quite a big group chat between there's maybe 4 other group chats going on. There's a CIA group chat, a Vatican group chat, a mafia group chat, etc. And it's like the big one where they have to coordinate. Sometimes we'll use that. So I don't know that it's been specifically tasked with this, but you might find that lots of people involved in that also have deep knowledge of the UFO thing because it's this transnational network, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I love that analogy. It's kind of like their Signal app, which is kind of what we've been. Yeah, it's kind of what you've been alluding to. That it seems to me like a platform where the people who were involved in something like that, or who were involved in some unsavory business, if you will, could go there and set up at the dinner table, or maybe in a corner off to the side of the dinner table. It's like, well, if we want to talk about something, we're going to the Knights of Malta dinner anyways. Maybe we could do it there. That seems more feasible because, I haven't seen the kind of extreme connection like you that Harold Malmgren has said. Doesn't mean it's not there, but very, very interesting. Okay, so quick time out here because you just mentioned RS-33 and Guglielmo Marconi. I've got something very interesting to bring up to you. I know you're a big fan of Messengers of Deception. Excellent book. I'm almost done with it, and I find it equally as fascinating. But in your latest video, you're kind of talking about. This is a bit of a rabbit hole, so apologies to everyone listening.
I'm into it. Let's do it.
Okay, so you talk about one of the most compelling arguments against the notion that we have recovered non-human technology is like, if we've had it for so long, why don't we see flying saucers flying around and battling each other in Iran right now? What's going on? And you brought up this really good point from this discussion between Jacques Vallée, Major Murphy, that what if that's not what we gleaned from certain technology? What if it isn't a very fast craft, but what if it's something that uses electromagnetic energy to alter perception, to turn cars off, to do this and that? And that is something that if you look at many different UFO cases, it seems on its surface level, as someone who doesn't understand the electromagnetic spectrum very well, that it is part of the either side effect or tool belt of the NHI. That's something, it has some relationship to that. Okay, dude, 2 nights ago, I'm reading John Keel's book called The Eighth Tower, Ultra-Terrestrials and the Super Spectrum. And he is talking about how near Rome in 1936, there were scores of sheep that were just found dead. And people were doing, veterinarians were looking at these dead sheep and they couldn't find out why the heck they were dead. What is going on? It turns out that Guglielmo Marconi was doing experiments with frequencies, with radio frequencies and with microwave frequencies, focusing, and he was discovering these early concepts, I think in the 1920s, of what radar is, that metal objects can reflect these frequencies. Turns out his microwave experiments were killing these sheep.
Wow.
And they could also turn off cars.
Oh my goodness.
And I'm just like, Whoa, like whether or not that has anything to do with RS-33 or Magenta or whatever, it's like, did he just stumble on one of the facets of the NHI? Like, that's wild. Like, I don't know the provenance of which, but that's a crazy synchronicity.
That is so interesting. Yeah, that is crazy interesting. I became really interested in like the microwave frequency stuff because of some of Vallée's comments in that book and in his journals, and some other things I've seen where it's like there seems to be ongoing experiments trying to figure out what any kind of like wave frequency can do to things. Like, can it put someone to sleep? Can it make things appear in their minds? Can it wake them up? Can you turn off electronics? And, this is interesting because those, like you're saying, those are some of the things we experience during an abduction, right? Like suddenly I'm unable to move and something's coming into my mind. My car stopped. And it really, really forces us to ask, could some of these profoundly magical experiences that people report, could they be simulated? And there seems to be a lot of hints that they could be. It's so interesting to hear that Marconi, 3 years after the Magenta crash, is experimenting with that, which is absolutely also what Vallée is. His source is indicating that's what happened in Nazi Germany too, is they discovered that the flying thing wasn't necessarily going to be successful, at least in the short term, but they discovered they could mess with people's minds. I think there's something there. And I also think it's worth considering. I've had some conversations recently where I was butting heads with people about, someone said to me, they were like, all this Nazi stuff about UFOs is BS, it's not real. And I was like, whoa, hear me out, it's like, it's not just that. It's not like, for me, I'm not saying like the Nazis made discs. Like they definitely were trying, but something may have happened. It might be that they had a nuclear breakthrough. It might have been this psychotronic stuff. It might have been some propulsion stuff. But whatever that is, it's a big deal. Okay. And it may have involved something landing that's non-human, or it may not have. But there's so much suspicious activity around their developments that you come away thinking, well, who got hold of them and what did it become? So that is super interesting, JP. I wonder if we can find more examples in the war of like, unaccounted weird deaths or cars turning off and stuff like that. That'd be super interesting.
It would. I wish I knew more about it and had prepared for it. But to mind, just because we're on this topic, is so much freaking fun, man. But I can think of 2 modern examples. And again, I want to make this very clear. I have no idea if this has anything to do with reverse engineered technology. But if you just think of it like, if you think of these 2 examples, one is we've got this rumor during the attack on Venezuela by the U.S. military. Sorry, everybody, I'm American. That wasn't my decision. But, I don't know the provenance of this account, but there was this tweet flowing around that claimed to be from this Venezuelan who was there when Delta Force arrived to take, is it Maduro? Is that his name?
Oh yeah.
And he said that, and I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden, all of us were unable to move. We were frozen in place. We couldn't do anything. And then these Blackhawks arrived, and these guys got out. They were incredibly advanced. They moved super fast, and we couldn't do anything. And so this rumor comes about of the discombobulator, that maybe the U.S. has this directed energy weapon that can do this or that. That's very shaky. I have no way of corroborating that as a legitimate thing. However, there is a legitimate device that I believe UAP Gerb has mentioned this in one of his videos, and there's a video of it. I apologize, I don't know which military contractor it is, but it is the videotape tests of this device that it's attached to a truck, and it looks like this big metal hexagon thing, and they point it at crowds. And the point is that it inserts this radiation just a few millimeters into the person's skin, and it makes them go "Whoa!" and freak out and run the other way. And they use it as deterrence. They use it on allegedly secret military bases to ward off U.S. citizens without killing them, just to push them away, essentially. And I mean, if they've created that, don't you think that they could turn that dial up to 11? You know what I mean? And I mean, what kind of ethics come into play when we're talking about devices like that? So if you think any one of those stories could be real, which one of them certainly is, then what else do they have, you know?
Yeah, 100%. And it's 90 years since that Marconi experiments that you were referencing, you know, and you think about it, like all the technology that we know about in the public domain is usually like physical tech. Of course you would want to investigate the power of microwaves and frequencies, because that can go across distances without physical equipment. Huge advantage. I would not be surprised if trillions of dollars have been poured into projects like that. So yeah, dude, so interesting. Very interesting. Cool rabbit hole. I was happy to go there with you. Yeah.
Thanks for letting me spit that one out. So one of the things that you said before we went down this rabbit hole is, and this really ties into your latest video, which everyone needs to go check out is immediately after this video. Don't pause this one. But you touch on so many different figures that happen to be involved with the Knights of Malta, but were also involved in this other corporation. And you tie this into, what if this is the international corporation that comes up in Peter Levenda's books, if I have that correctly, where he mentions this kind of fictionalized multinational corporation called the Maynard Consortium. And so honestly, the connections that you drew in there have much more veins and roots that could come out of it than I think the Knights of Malta. So could you help us kind of wrap our minds around how we could transition from that to this?
Yeah. This is really, I think, connected, because I'll give you guys, just before I give you that story, this organization, which I found, is called the World Commerce Corporation. Other people have spoken about it before, but I think I found new connections. Has very clear connections to the Vatican. There's 4 or 5 people who like are Knights of Malta or Vatican adjacent involved in it. And also later is doing things that are very, very connected with the Vatican. So it is I think these kinds of things are totally need to be looked at together. So let me explain to everyone, like I'll take 5 minutes to explain what this organization is. In 2014, Tom DeLonge approached a fiction author called A.J. Hartley and said, I'd like to write a novel about the secret space program. And that novel ends up becoming Secret Machines, which is his first major fiction book. And it's actually decent. I listened to the audiobook. It does, especially if you're into UFOs, it really keeps you going. And it genuinely introduces new ideas, okay? On the front of the novel, it says based on real events. So that keeps you super curious, because you're listening, you're thinking, well, what's the thing here that he wants us to learn about? So interesting. In the novel, one of the things that's very new that really isn't talked about very much in the UFO space is that the UFO secrecy is not being fundamentally controlled by the CIA, the Air Force, the Department of Energy. It may root back to a single private corporation, which is essentially a weird consortium. It's called the Maynard Consortium. That company has a few qualities involved in it. Number one, it was founded in the late 40s, so like 1945 to 1949 window. Number two, its original financiers come from Swiss bank accounts. Very mysterious, basically implying the money's coming from somewhere secret, maybe like a Nazi origin, you know? The company is co-run by Western elites, a lot of like British establishment people, American powerful people, but also there's some like German people who are very clearly implied to be Nazis. They're really not nice people who are involved in this company. The company uses shadow corporations, like these little subsidiaries through which it funnels things. And these companies appear and disappear. There's loads of them. And ultimately what Maynard is doing is it's funneling secret aerospace technology and money into very specific countries, which are very strange because this is in the context of the Cold War. You're like, America has a space program, Russia has a space program, who's going to win? Meanwhile, this group of transnational business people involving the Nazis is funneling stuff to Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and Nigeria and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Tunisia. These are weird countries. And the point is they've got a secret space program in these countries that is being funneled by this private group. It's basically a privatized space program that's top secret. So anyway, there's a bunch of other things there is actually one more detail. In 1964, the Maynard Consortium moves hundreds of billions of dollars into something called SWEEP, which is like this weird new entity. And in the book, DeLong's very clear. It's 1964. Hundreds of billions of dollars are being moved through like a money laundering process and ultimately end up going into something mysterious called SWEEP, which is like this weird intelligence service, private intelligence service. Okay. So I became convinced, and I'm more convinced than ever. I really, really am. The company involved is the World Commerce Corporation. It was founded in 1945. And basically, the people who ended up running it are very suspicious just straight away. Because during the war, the people running the intelligence networks were Wild Bill Donovan and Alan Dulles, who ran the OSS. In the UK, you had Charles Hambro, who was the director of the Bank of England. He was running the Special Operations Executive, which is wartime intel in UK. There's a guy called Will Stevenson, who basically acts as a conduit between those two groups, running something called the British Security Coordination. And then there's an agency that's specifically focused on South America, which is the Office for the Coordination of Inter-American Affairs, which has Nelson Rockefeller running it, which is very strange because the Rockefellers were in bed with the Nazis, and he's operating the intelligence agency, which has a bottleneck over South America, which is where all the Nazis were going. Yeah. Super suspicious, but we don't have to get into that. Anyway, as World War II ends, all those intelligence agencies get shut down because guess what? Like back then, people were outraged at the idea of a permanent intelligence establishment. Whereas today we're like 20 intelligence agencies, totally fine, whatever, but different times. So those people I just listed all end up, as soon as those are shut down, they all immediately move to the World Commerce Corporation. While Bill Donovan copies all of his microfilm, all of his documents into microfilm from the OSS, steals them and takes them to this company. The company's headquarters is literally the same address as the British Security Coordination, which was the agency that Will Stevenson was running. So it's just very clearly a continuation. The company also absorbs Nazi gold. So it's got like $10 million of Nazi gold and jewels that we know about. It may be that there's lots more, which hasn't been documented. It absorbs Nazi companies that have been set up to help the Nazis survive after the war. And there's lots of interesting connections to aerospace, minerals, all of these things. Now, it matches DeLong's, it's got 450 subsidiaries as well, which is highly suspicious. And in the next video, which I'm going to make soon, we're going to show how it was funneling technology to those countries I listed, and what looks like genuinely something very strange going on in those places. So really interesting. There's also many other reasons why I'm convinced about it, and it has to do with the Vatican. So people involved in this organization included, like I said, Wild Bill Donovan. He's one of the founding members, a Knight of Malta. You also have a person who's papal aristocracy, Boncampi Ludovisi, who is related to Pope Gregory. He's also connected to a lot of other Knights of Malta. He's connected to the Magenta crash. And of course, papal aristocracy means he's connected to the Vatican in a big, big way. There are others as well. Let me just review my notes here quickly. John McCone, future CIA director, also Knights of Malta, also involved in this company. Charles Hambro, one of the founders of the World Commerce Corporation, has been involved in Vatican finance because he runs his own bank. So he was helping with Vatican finance before the war, but he's the person where it gets really interesting. In 1964, Charles Hambro is working with the Vatican Bank and with a bunch of mafia financiers who are basically creating the world's largest money laundering system ever. It's someone called Michele Sindona, who was basically the king of the world in terms of money laundering for the Vatican, for the mafia, for the CIA. He was recruited by James Jesus Angleton, this Michele Sindona. Angleton, Knights of Malta. Sindona's job was to use the Vatican Bank and about 10 other banks to create a daisy chain of transactions. So I can put this money, which I've accrued through illegal activities, I can put it into the system. By the time it comes out the other end, you have no idea where it came from. It is completely clean. You can't detect that it was involved in drug money. And so I can now spend that money without anyone getting suspicious. So to do this, Sindona has to buy multiple banks. He buys them and he takes a 40% stake in them. 22% is acquired by a Mormon guy connected to the CIA, which is very interesting. Another 22% is purchased by Charles Hambro, one of the founding members of the World Commerce Corporation. So Charles Hambro is actively involved in helping to build this money laundering network. This is really important because it climaxes in 1964 when Sindona is suddenly able to move hundreds of billions of dollars through his network into we don't know what. It just disappears offshore. That's what DeLong describes in the novel with the Maynard Consortium, right? 1964, hundreds of billions of dollars are moved around invisibly and get funneled into this thing called sweep. You can see a World Commerce Corporation director involved in building the infrastructure for exactly that in the real world. And it involves the Vatican Bank and the Knights of Malta and the Mafia. So there is absolutely a connection between these two things, because ultimately what you've got here is how do we take intelligence, governance, control, and take it out of the government? That's what the World Commerce Corporation is. It's wartime intelligence gone private. It's stealing the spoils of a war, which should have been given to the American people and to the Western peoples. It's stealing those and taking it into private hands. And the Vatican and the Knights of Malta are similarly unaccountable private networks that don't answer to anyone. So it's no wonder we see them intermingling. And, in parts 2 and 3 of the story I'm going to tell, you're going to see more of these connections. And it's very, very interesting.
It is very interesting, and I'm incredibly hyped up for your part 2 and 3, man. It's really, really cool, and the thing you're laying out for us really does sound like the self-licking ice cream cone that kind of David Grush is talking about. I think maybe he's talking a little bit more in relation to in the United States, but you've got this really sketchy stuff going on. And the things you're describing, there's this whole story of Nazis escaping to South America, for example. But because they're tied in with this, as you laid out in your video, they're tied in with this World Commerce Corporation. You don't really do that type of thing if you're just going to take a vacation in Argentina after the war. Like that's the type of money you do if you're going to do some business. And, if you look at people like Angleton, for example, who I imagine are this part of this stock of people, they don't stop. They in one of his latest interviews, he's like, one of my biggest regrets is retiring. Like, I want to be back in the CIA. And you can imagine these people who've held on to power so long and they lost. Of course, they're going to try and figure a way out to continue doing crazy shit in other places. Yeah. And you're talking about earlier, it's like how people have a hard time grasping, like they think, the Nazi UFO thing is complete BS. And it's like, you're giving us example of a international shady ass corporation involved with money laundering, involved with Nazis, involved with industry that is funneling money to all kinds of other countries, including South America. Yeah. And so, and why the heck are they making aerospace technology? God dang, man. Like, I don't even know where to go from here other than another rabbit hole, because what your latest video did is make the notion of this shadowy non-government shady organization being involved in the UFO topic a little more tactile, a little bit less stigmatized. And, you know, like, is it possible that there are advanced aerospace vehicles in these countries because of this corporation? I think your answer is kind of pointing to yes, if I'm correct. It's possible. I'll just am I correct in that? Okay.
Yeah, I think that the secret machines plot seems to indicate two things. Firstly, there's a aerospace vehicle called the Arrowhead, which is created. It's like Mach 3 capable, can fly in space, has advanced laser weapons. So it's not a disc. It's like a wildly far more advanced craft than anything else the governments of the world have made, but it's in private hands. So it doesn't belong to those nations. Those nations are being exploited because they're very, no one would think to look there. And the other thing that I'm suspicious of is general space access and maybe putting satellites in space that have nefarious purposes. So that's kind of where that goes. And I certainly think that both of those things are possible / likely. I would point to the testimony of Matthew Brown, who is former State Department weapons kind of non-proliferation analyst, who came out and said that George Knapp asked him, if we've reversed engineered these things, are we able to use them? And Matthew Brown says, well, if those things aren't really in the hands of the governments. They may be allowed to use some of that for certain purposes, but ultimately that's controlled by another group that sits above the government. That's a very interesting thought, right? Because then when Louis Elizondo says, well, these things aren't Chinese, they're not Russian, they're not American, it's like, yeah, you're using sovereign nation states sort of terminology here. What if it's not about countries, but it's still human? Not all of it, but some of it. What if some of it is human, but doesn't belong to a nation?
Yes, exactly. And this is where things get both incredibly, like, I start salivating, but I also have to be super careful because, unlike you, my knowledge is much more in terms of looking at the intelligence behind the phenomenon and looking at the patterns of the experiencers and seeing what can be found, the similarities between modern experiences and historical experiences. It's much less in your expertise, which is much more tracing the money, looking at the figureheads of different companies and how that might relate to the UFO topic and how that relates to history. But there is another rabbit hole that your video kind of opens up the possibility of. Are you familiar with the Peruvian face peelers in 2023?
Yes. I don't know the story that well, but something weird was going on, right?
Yes. So I'll try to briefly lay this out for you. So this is really big credit to, oh my goodness, what's his name? Let me look this up real quick.
Timothy Alberino?
Yes, thank you so much. That's embarrassing. For people who don't know, podcasts cast a spell on me where I can't remember names I normally remember. But all credit to this guy because he, okay, so let me back up for a second. There was an event in 2023 in several areas in Peru, chiefly in this one village called San Antonio de Pintillacu in Peru, in this very small village. And they kept showing videos of people freaking out and chasing unseen things in the jungle. And then they would show these videos of young folks who were passed out and had like gouges and what looked like someone was trying to peel their face off. And so Timothy Alberino's like, who's going to go down and check it out? And, nobody was. And the authorities were checking it out and they were saying, well, this is just some people who are they're miners who are trying to scare off the indigenous population so they can get to the mines. And he's like, miners with jetpacks? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Like, what miner has that type of budget? Okay. And when you start looking at it, these face peelers were described as humanoid people wearing black suits with some type of armor that would bounce off shotgun pellets, and they had like glowing yellow eyes that the people who watched Marvel movies all the time said it looked like the Green Goblin's eyes. And they were flying these two platforms that each foot would go on, and they would just go straight up into the sky, and they would fly away really quickly. And there were UFOs sighted at the same time. And there's this whole discussion of, is this actually some corporation or some weird human trying to scare off people, or is this the phenomenon? And it's a very, it's a very interesting mystery. But when you take into account the things that you put in your video, it's like you've got these long-standing factions of non-military, creepy organizations that have funneled money into South American countries and have histories with being associated with people who are very unethical, people like Nazis, people, very shady stuff. And so it raises the question, is that a people who have advanced aerospace technology, or is it the phenomenon? Like, they had this one young woman who was interviewed by Timothy Alberino, said that she was grabbed by these two people, and one she called the gringo and spoke Spanish like a gringo, and the other one spoke Spanish like a local. And they grabbed her, and they were talking about how careful not to do it this way. Her skin will be ruined if you do it this way. And then the rest of the village heard her screaming and came in to try to save her, and they saw these beings or people, and then they escaped. So it's like, and when I think about your video, I'm like, is it possible that humans are behind that? Like some crazy Epstein thing is behind that. But I don't know, man. I don't know what you think, but I don't know if I'm going too deep down the rabbit hole, but crazy stuff.
I think this is just so important, because even if that specific case, isn't human, okay, we need to really, when I spoke with Jesse, we talked about this idea of nation states and about how they are linguistically prevent us from doing proper analysis, because we are constantly trying to understand, is it Russia versus Ukraine? Is it Israel versus Iran? And those concepts don't do justice to the complexities of the situation. Like Al-Qaeda, it's not a country, but you need to understand that concept to understand that conflict. And similarly, it could be that there are transnational organizations. Some of them may literally be businesses. Some of them may be like chivalric orders. Maybe they're overlapping. Maybe there's a transnational intelligence network or something. I don't know. But those concepts need to be thought about because if the World Commerce Corporation led to something else, because it shut down in 1985, if it kept birthing new things, it's been a long time since World War II. And that organization absolutely appears to have been trying to corner scientific technology. So, by now it's 2026. We're all thinking, we thought we were going to be in flying cars. Like, what happened? Like, the technology has been so slow in normal culture. Probably hasn't been in private industry. The motivations for secrecy are so big. The element of surprise is critical. Like, if I'm going to fight a conflict, I do not want anyone to know what I've got. But then, of course, if I'm a private entity that seized control of some of these things, I don't want you to be able to see, analyze, or understand my capabilities. So, I don't know about the face peeler thing. I mean, it's very strange. Just the way you described it, it's like, I was like, should I make a video about this? This is just wild. It's like such an interesting story. But yeah, I think this is it's just very, very worthy of consideration. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it gets muddier because of some of the things I've mentioned to you before. So there was a United States military operation, I forget the name, in Peru at that time.
Exercise Resolute Sentinel 23 kicks off today within the U.S. Southern Command Area of Responsibility and will be conducted through July 13. Resolute Sentinel-23 is a joint combined multinational field training exercise focused on joint all-domain operations, rapid response capabilities, civil military operations, and wartime mission essential tasks. Approximately 970 U.S. military personnel from the U.S. Air Force, U.S. Space Force, Marine Corps, Army, and Coast Guard will participate alongside interagency personnel from the FBI, DEA, Homeland Security, and 7 partner nations to include Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Brazil, Panama, Uruguay, and the UK.
And we're not sure, like you say, linguistically, how we're limited in describing certain things. We're not sure what is being confabulated and what is lost in translation. You know, say, oh, he had a laser, he had glowing eyes. Well, wouldn't that be a way you would describe a special forces guy at night? He's got these, 180-degree nods on, and he's got a laser, which would be likely invisible and in infrared, in the infrared part of the spectrum. So there's that. But nearby, this I got to give credit to this guy named Lately on YouTube. He showed how there was reports and photos in a nearby place called Okabamba. There were scores of sheep and chickens who were found dead, like mysteriously dead, and it looked like some type of puncture went through their skull. And because of the things that I've told you about Marconi, right, and also some of the things I'm researching right now and the patterns of the phenomenon and cattle mutilations, it's like that would be an indication of something being non-human. Yeah. Unless you're someone like Marconi who's messing around with stuff he shouldn't be.
At the end of August, in the region of Apurimac in Okabamba, over 30 sheep were found dead and mutilated.
33 ovejas aparecieron muertas y presentan perforación en sus cráneos.
Muertas. Las causas aún desconocemos. Son situaciones que de verdad nunca han pasado en nuestra zona en este sitio, pero esto ha conmocionado a toda la población. Heridas no tienen, lo único que presentan estos animalitos ya muertos son perforaciones en el cráneo, exactamente en el cráneo, en todas las ovejas, y también no tienen ya ojos los animalitos. Otras heridas no tienen.
And so, but at the same time, that's exactly how the phenomenon has operated. It operates in the margins. And we don't know. And it's also very much like how these intelligence agencies you've outlined operate. They operate in the margins. They operate in the shadows. They operate in very sketchy places. They hide the cookie jar way up high where we, the little toddlers, can't get to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, man, I'm so fascinated how our UFO researchers end up uncovering things that may not have anything to do with UFOs, but it certainly has to do with how we need to be paying attention to how corrupt our leaders have been over the decades.
100%. And I actually think it's just really important that, if we label ourselves UFO researchers, we don't become preoccupied with just the UFO, because the reality is there's been a huge thing going on for like 100 years with government's intelligence technology. And actually it's quite, there's so much to learn there. There's so much information that you can tangibly figure out. I was just thinking there's one more real big crossover here, which we haven't discussed. It might be a good thing to wrap up on, is Operation Gladio. When I think about the Knights of Malta and the Vatican and how they interface with some of these issues, I think Operation Gladio is hugely important. For those who aren't familiar, I'll run you through it, but I highly, highly recommend a book by Paul Williams called Operation Gladio. It's definitely not the first book you should read when you get into this world, but once you've been in for a while, it is, I think, critical background to understand the emergence of the deep state. Let me give you the high level here. So after World War II, I talked about Reinhard Gehlen earlier. Certain people in the US, specifically Alan Dulles, James Jesus Angleton, and a couple of others, were very keen to create stay-behind armies. So this was let's have an intelligence network in Europe that by day they look like normal citizens, but they're actually a vast intelligence network that we can use. And similarly, to have like sleeper armies. So these would be militaries that day to day they got about their jobs, but they had weapons and all the equipment they needed to quickly fight a war stashed away. So we know Reinhard Gehlen was elected to run the intelligence side. The group also asked a guy called Prince Junio Borghesi, who was part of the Italian nobility, who had basically run a huge fascist militia group in Italy during the war. So he was also asked to create one of these stay-behind groups. Reinhard Gehlen is a Knight of Malta. Prince Borghese is also a Knight of Malta. James Jesus Angleton, the guy who's involved in setting this up, Knight of Malta. Operation Gladio is so important, not only because it involves weird, dubious stuff like this, but because it sets off a series of activities that begin to create a vast deep state apparatus. You know, ostensibly it's a government operation, but it quickly spawns something the government can't control. So you have these stay-behind armies. They start to appear everywhere. All over Europe, you've got groups of people reporting like these weird militia groups. And sometimes there's terrorist activity happening, which can be traced back to this sort of network of militias, okay, which is very interesting. Because you're like, sometimes you might think there's been a terrorist act, but it's actually a false flag that was secretly like a covert operation. This is happening in post-war era. Anyway, as Gladio is getting set up, initially it's funded with, I believe, private money. Paul Williams specifically calls out the Rockefellers as funding this, which is very strange. I couldn't find an original source for that, by the way. So it's possible Paul Williams could be wrong, but it raises the question, the OSS had been shut down. Who was funding all of this stuff and who was really controlling it? Because you've got two people there who are basically rogue, who report into the Vatican probably more than they report into the Americans. Anyway, in the book, Paul Williams explains that at the same time, a specific guy, oh man, I can't remember his name. I can see his face though. Paul Helliwell, a guy called Paul Helliwell. He had been involved in the OSS in China during the war, and he'd seen something very interesting, which is that there was a specific military group out there that needed to fund itself. It didn't have funding. And so what it did is it controlled the drug trade. It made all of its money from the drug trade, and that enabled it to fund itself off the books without needing to go and get money from people they weren't going to get money from because they weren't going to be permitted to do what they were doing. It worked excellently. Paul Helliwell comes back to Alan Dulles, James Jesus Angleton, and the group and says, why don't we do this? And so they do. And so you may have heard of the stories about the CIA somehow being involved in the drug game. And it was. Essentially what they do is they recruit the mafia, the Sicilian, Corsican, Turkish mafias, along with a bunch of other people some of whom are connected to the World Commerce Corporation, by the way, to set up a huge drug industry, which starts to generate a lot of money, which means that they don't have to go to Congress and say, we need money for this Gladio thing we're doing. They can fund this off the books through the drug trade. So you've got a really secret, dubious operation, which requires the creation of an industry to fund it. But this now requires another creation, which is the money laundering apparatus we talked about earlier. So suddenly now there's all of this money that's being generated, but they have to wash it. And so this is where the Vatican gets involved again, like I said earlier, with Michele Sindona. Again, the people around Michele Sindona, Knights of Malta. Eventually, this leads to something that is indescribable. You have militia groups that don't officially report into a government spread throughout the world, sleeper cells, effectively. You have a global drug trade which keeps growing, which is effectively sanctioned by the highest powers in intelligence, but is ultimately, they don't have control over it. It's generating money which is being fed through the biggest money laundering system ever created. All the people involved in building that money laundering system who would face public scrutiny. Sometimes there were attempts to bring these people into court. They would all end up dead. Some of them would be poisoned. Some of them would be hung from bridges. One of them was hung from Blackfriars Bridge in London. Blackfriars has traditionally been connected to a specific Vatican group It was a very clear sign and symbol. I can't remember exactly which one. Anyway, the point here is, whereas I don't know that there's any smoking gun evidence that the Knights of Malta control UFOs. I think there is plenty of evidence that the Knights of Malta was one of the most important factions in the emergence of the deep state, which in turn likely has profound control over UFOs. And that is where I think, that's where, after all of my research, I land on the Knights of Malta as critical there. The interface between the mafia, the Vatican, the intelligence networks, the drug trades, and the intelligentsia, the nobility, all of that, with a general conservative bent towards protecting the status quo and not allowing anyone to question them. So hopefully that's a useful kind of trajectory to consider.
Absolutely it is. And you said it best, man. It's like their little chat group. It's like their little signal. It makes so much more sense than, oh, they're the UFO people, even though they have a history of like being interested in the occult. I think it's a much more responsible and well-researched and careful position to take in regards to this. And I hope people who are listening to this understand that. And for people who have any issue with the idea of these intelligence agencies and shadowy groups and corporations being involved with money laundering through the drug trade, you only need to look at, there's a video, I believe it's of like CNN or something like that during the war in Afghanistan. And it's a video of these soldiers guarding a poppy field. So if you're against drugs, wouldn't you just get rid of it and burn it? Why is that so important to guard?
Yeah.
Why keep it growing? I mean, come on, guys. Like, Jesus.
Yeah. Well, it's useful, isn't it? It's useful to generate lots of money. And, I'd come back to Matthew Brown. I think everyone should listen to and re-listen Matthew Brown's original interview. And he says that this issue is controlled by a combination of intelligence, military, political, transnational business, and criminal interests. I implore everybody to pay attention to that. I'm not going to spell out what that means, but we should consider that this is maybe involves things that you wouldn't expect to be involved in controlling all of this. It goes beyond government. It's pretty scary stuff.
It is pretty scary stuff, man. Well, Jason, I once again sincerely appreciate you taking your time to being on the show, being with the audience here and helping us understand just a little bit further into some of the shady ass stuff that we've accumulated as humans on this planet, man. I really appreciate it, dude.
Yeah, dude, JP, it's always awesome to hang out. I enjoy nerding out in our little rabbit holes, and it has been cool to focus on such a specific topic. So I really appreciate hanging out, and I guess we'll do it again at some point.
I would love that, man. Hey everyone, if you've watched this episode all the way to the end, thank you. I really appreciate you. And isn't Jason the best? Every single time I talk with the guy, I have an absolute blast, and I just really appreciate him as a person. Super nice guy. But I'm here to talk with you about some important announcements. If you've been watching Realm Travel and you just want more, well, good news, because I've just launched my Patreon and there's some pretty sweet perks. For the past few months, I've been secretly collecting exclusive stories from our guests that they saved just for you. For example, if you want to know the wild synchronicities that Jason Samosa has been having recently, then head on over there and check it out. Also, you'll receive each and every episode 1 day early and ad-free if you sign up. And of course, as we continue to grow and improve, so will the breadth of these Patreon benefits. I really want to give you as much bang for your buck as possible if you decide to support Realm Travel. And also, just a reminder, the next big episode of Realm Travel is next, and it's an absolute monster. So if you want to learn more and see it before everyone else does, head on over to Patreon. And finally, we have one last message.